Um, we are finishing the day with Jacob Means, performer and educator who thrive on creating new sound while maintaining a deep relationship with African American folk music. His music and approach to playing creates a welcoming space for collaborators and audiences to experience the unknown. His music ranges from poignant to playful while reflecting a sense of space inspired by the Great Rocky Mountains and clear sky of Wyoming where he grew up. Means began playing the mandolin at a young age, and he has traveled around the world performing and teaching across the US, Central America, Europe, and China. His versatility and quest for meaningful connection in diverse settings have solidified his view of music as an inclusive tool for positive social change. I would like also to welcome as his committee member, faculty, and friend Joe Walsh. Please, a warm applause and welcome for being here. Thank you so much. And Jacob advisor was Alan Chase. Please welcome Jacob Means. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Marco. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome to the Global Mandolin Project, a search for identity. I look at this project as basically a DNA test of the mandolin. I wanted to answer this basic question. Where did the mandolin come from and where is it going? So my mission during this project was to contribute to propelling the mandolin forward and expanding the scope of mandolin music today. How I did this was to examine significant historical contributions to music that's played on the mandolin today through a historical study of the instrument itself, and to internalize and reinterpret those musical characteristics from the different cultures that I studied that had an impact on the mandolin, including Africa, Italy, Scotland, and Brazil. Then I would synthesize the information through my own artistic process, which this year has been largely influenced by the zero gravity approach, which we've heard about before, but it's kind of this approach of rearranging musical roles and looking for the potential in the music where anything could happen at the moment where you're creating. So some features of the mandolin that are unique are the fact that it has double strings. So a lot of mandolins now have 2 strings per course, and they have 4 courses of strings, although there are some variations. As you can see, the electric mandolin here that I play has only 5 strings, but each one is tuned differently, whereas the acoustic mandolin has 8 strings, but they're tuned in pairs. So the mandolin, as we know it today, really comes from Naples, Italy. It was developed there in the late 16th century. Prior to that, it was influenced by the lute. Prior to that, the oud, and prior to that, the barbat, which is a Persian instrument. All these instruments are plucked instruments, and they often have doubled strings, just like the mandolin does today. So let's get to the music. The first place that I composed a piece on was the African influence. So I looked mostly at North and West Africa and the instruments there, including the ngori and the kora, which I kind of related to the mandolin. The ngori is a lower instrument, kind of like a bass. It's really groovy. And the kora is more harp-like, but it has a lot of strings on it, and it has a big range. So it has high-pitched strings and low-pitched strings as well. So I used that to compose my piece. I wanted to have a lot of jumps and different pitches in my piece. And then I also used the blues form, which it comes from Africa. So the blues form is kind of declamatory style, like it's very related to the speech. So when I was listening to the kora, I heard that the way they play the melodies, it's very speech-like. So I wanted to use that to bring me to the blues. Then for the rhythm, I use a 12/8 rhythm, and that's kind of connects to the modern jazz and the swing feel that we have now. So let's take a listen to Africa. Thank you. The next place we'll travel to is Italy. As I said before, Italy had a huge influence on the mandolin as an instrument. It was really developed there, and this mandolin that I have here is an American-style mandolin, but it came from the Italian style. So during that time when the mandolin was being developed in the late 16th, early 17th century, I wanted to choose that time to look at the musical influences that I could use. So a lot of composers were writing for dances and different occasional music. So I chose to use that as an element of style for my composition, and also used Vivaldi's Mandolin Concerto in C major as an additional inspiration. So a lot of the harmony in this music, in Baroque music, is very diatonic. Sometimes there are secondary dominants, but they usually always resolve where you would expect. The form that I used was binary form, which was a popular form then. So I have a free section in the beginning and then a rhythmic section as the B section. And the melody, I also kind of used shapes from Vivaldi. So a lot of scalar, some jumps, but not too many. And then another interesting, really fun style that I found, this technique called the duo style. So what that is basically exactly what it sounds like, where one person plays, but it sounds like two instruments playing. So that effect is created by this separation of pitch and a repetition. So I'll give an example. Something like that. So on the top is an excerpt of Vivaldi's score, and on the bottom is part of my composition. And I've highlighted some similarities, some elements that I chose to use from Vivaldi. For example, the phrase lengths. So we have two short phrases and then a longer phrase. And then a harmonic structure, which I took parts of for the beginning part of my tune, the A section, specifically this 1-5-1-5 movement. And then later on in the B section, you'll hear as the tenor takes a solo, we used these chords, Vivaldi's chords, for the tenor solo. So you'll hear that in the example. Here is Italy. Here's the second excerpt. Here's the second part of the B section. All right. Thank you. Now we'll go to the Celtic nations. I found this really fascinating, the amount of connections that I found here and the different cultural exchanges that were happening were just really, there were so many. Partially the Irish and Scottish people immigrated to the US, a lot of them did in the 19th century. So with them, they brought their own musical traditions. And then when they would move back, they would bring the different instruments like the mandolin back to that area. So it became part of the tradition there. As well as that, there was the European influence from different ways. Like, for example, if the King of Scotland, after Queen Elizabeth died, the King of Scotland became the King of England. So there's just one example of how different boundaries were being drawn and things were happening. So there was a lot of trade, different wars, different things happening there. So the influences musically that I took from these Celtic traditions were really the rhythmic aspect of the melody. And because there wasn't a lot of drum set or drums in that music, in the tradition of that music, the rhythm had to be taken care of by other things. So a lot of the melodies are very rhythmic, very eighth note-y. Sometimes all the instruments will just play the melody together, and the accompaniment instruments are very rhythmic as well. So the harmony is very modal, usually like 2 or 3 chords maybe. Could be more, but that's the basic thing. A binary form. The melody is very scalar. There are some leaps. For example, the mandolin techniques, there's a thing that happens, it's kind of similar to the duo style, but it's a more rhythmic thing. I'll give an example of that. So you hear that? That repetition is more of a rhythmic thing. Yeah. So this is a tune called Miss Shepherd. It's a traditional Scottish fiddle tune. And let's take a listen. Here's the second excerpt of group improvisation. Thank you. Finally, we come to Brazil. During the Atlantic slave trade era of the 16th through the 19th centuries, Brazil received more slaves than any other country, and about 20 times more than in the US. So this fact, I think, has a lot to do with the richness of the musical traditions there. A lot of the music there is a combination of the African traditions brought over by slavery and the European influence, as well as different folk traditions from Brazil. So in my composition, I used harmony closer to what we consider jazz harmony, with a little bit more chromatic and extended tertiary structures. The form was inspired by choro music, with my listening. And there's usually 3 parts. It's like a rondo form. So there's an A, and then a different section, then it goes back to the first section, then it goes to something else. Very scalar and arpeggiated melodies. And the rhythm, as I said before, very rich, a lot of syncopation, a lot of off-beat emphasis. And the mandolin has this amazing balance between being incredibly lyrical and like a voice kind of, but also being like super groovy and with that really deep sense of rhythm. So I tried to do a little bit of those things in my piece called Brazil. Second section. Thank you. So my conclusions for this project, it's really hard to put it in a concise one-sentence thing, but if I had to say, this message that I received basically from doing this project is that just humanity is so much more connected than what we would think or appear on the surface. So I never thought, for example, going into this, like, oh yeah, it's obvious, like Brazil and Italy and Scotland are connected. But as soon as I just started looking for those connections, I almost couldn't stop finding them. There were so many connections that I found. So the next steps are to continue developing this project. There's a lot of places and cultures that I found that I would like to explore more and compose music on those topics as well. I want to compile all the information somewhere all in one place, like on a website, and then continue doing, releasing this music, playing concerts, teaching workshops, and stuff like that. So I have my bibliography here, and then a thank you to everybody. So
Jacob Means.
Thank you.
Very good. Excellent. So Joe, I give the microphone to you immediately as a committee member.
Well, first of all, it's just exciting to hear this kind of rhythmic language and improvisatory language and aesthetic on the mandolin. It's really, nobody's doing it. So cool. It's really cool to hear it.
Thank you.
Like the mandolin that I know so well, that sound meets Schofield or something, which to me is really wonderful. Like, it's nice that somebody did that, and I hope that I hope it gets a larger audience, because it's really cool to hear the mandolin in this context and so convincingly hanging with the drums or the piano and the sax, which oddly enough is a really rare combination. You make a good argument for why it should be a less rare combination. Yeah. And as far as like your stated goal of expanding the scope and propelling the music forward, I think it's really clear that you're doing that for the mandolin world with this. This music is both in terms of like what's being rhythmically stated with your improvisation. It feels like a language that you'd take for granted if you're listening to jazz all the time, but coming from the mandolin world, a lot of people haven't figured out how to do that and how to do it in such a fluid way. So it's great to hear. You're definitely expanding the scope and propelling the what's possible for the mandolin forward, from my perspective.
Thanks.
And it's cool that you're examining all these influences. I think that's really good. I a lot of times we just play music and don't consider where it's coming from, and I think it'd be a lot. I appreciate that you're considering where it's coming from, and I think you're making. It's cool that you take it as a challenge to write music that is both reflects you, but also it honors the origin. So that's most of what I have to say. I've never been to one of these before. Who's next?
Good. Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Beautiful, beautiful music.
Thank you.
The music kind of speaks for itself. I can hear, all the connections that you displayed. What are I don't know if I missed it, but the instrument, like in Brazil, they were playing the mandolin or something like the mandolin.
Yeah, they have an instrument that's really popular. I mean, the mandolin in Brazil there's kind of two things, I think. One is like the more modern version, which was popularized by this guy, Jacob do Bandolim. I don't think I'm saying it exactly right, but he was a composer, an amazing, prolific composer and his name is like Jacob of the mandolin. So that was his instrument, and he kind of repopularized that and the choro. But in Brazil, they have a mandolin. It's a little bit different looking than this one here. It's a little bit closer to the Italian style, where it's just round. But a lot of times they have 10 strings. So it's kind of a combination of the electric mandolin and this. It has a lower string on it, but they're tuned in pairs. So yeah, there's a lot of mandolin happening in Brazil.
Right, great. Um, it's interesting because, like, I heard you on these recordings. I heard you play a lot, I guess more, if that's the word, than I did, at the global rehearsals.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wonder why. I feel like I know more now about your personality, your musical personality, and your playing, just your playing in general. I mean, you were really tearing it up on, these recordings.
Thanks.
And I didn't hear that level of going for it sometimes at Global. So I was just wondering, maybe I'm all off. Maybe I was just not there on those days. But I was just wondering why that would be.
That's a really good question. I think I didn't really think about it, but I think if I did think about it right now, I would probably agree with you. And I think this project, I think, has been really important for me as a musician, because now I can see, like, yeah, I can play this music on the mandolin. Like, that's okay. And before all of this kind of came together, I was still unsure and, like, searching for my place, and trying to, reconcile, like, I come from a bluegrass background, folk music, with this jazz thing that now I know so much more about. And so I think there was some tentative, like, what am I really supposed to, is this okay? And then through this project, I've kind of learned, like, yeah, I can do this.
That's great. That's a lot of growth. Yeah, and like Joe mentioned John Schofield, and I was kind of hearing those things too. Whereas before, at some of the ensemble rehearsals, I just heard glimpses of it, like where I was thinking, "Wow, he could really go there," So I'm happy, to hear that you have. And the only other thing is you made a couple of references where you said zero gravity and free jazz, and I just want to say you might want to clarify that a little more, because zero gravity is not free. It has some freedom in it.
Right.
But you know what I mean? So I just don't want people to think that zero gravity and free jazz are the same.
Okay.
Excellent music. I love the Scottish piece.
Thank you.
Miss Shepherd? Yeah.
Yeah, Miss Shepherd, yeah. Thank you.
Man, Jacob, I reiterate everything Terry said. The music really just is powerful. It really speaks for itself. And I was wondering, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your process of research, because it seemed like you had a lot of things to say and a lot of in-depth knowledge. Maybe you could talk about how you went about, like what traditions were you already aware of or deep into, which ones were kind of new to you, and what you did.
Yeah. So my process was basically the seed of the idea of this project was to see if I could try to get this mandolin that I'm playing today to connect to Africa. That was my idea. I was like, because we talk so much in the Institute about connecting and finding, rhythmic connections to African traditions, how the African rhythms affected and actually created the swing feel, the jazz rhythm. So I wanted to do that on this instrument, for this instrument. So that was the first part. So what I did was I just tried to trace the instrument itself back and see where it was going, because I knew that it came from Italy, but I didn't really know any details or anything else really besides that. So I wanted to see what happened before Italy, and then I wanted to see in depth more what happened, like how did that happen? How did the oud become the lute? How did the lute become the mandolin? So a lot of my research was focused on the instrument itself. And then because of that, and nothing happens in a vacuum, so how does the mandolin get from Italy to Ireland? Well, people bring it there. So that kind of broadened my scope into the people and the different cultures and what was going on, like what music were they playing on the mandolin at that time? What music, was happening? What other folk traditions were happening then that could have had an influence on the music that was being written and performed on the mandolin? So that was my basic process, and then I just had to choose. So I knew I wanted to do Africa, to make that connection, and then the other connections. I mean, I knew of the Scottish and Irish connection to American folk music, Appalachian folk music, because that's kind of the tradition that I grew up playing on the mandolin, specifically bluegrass music. So there's a lot of Irish fiddle tunes, and that tradition is very strong in the bluegrass tradition that I grew up in. So I knew there were connections there, but I wanted to figure out what were they and why were they there. So those were just a few examples of that.
Amazing. Yes, it sounds so scholarly. Like you could put these together in some writing and stuff. And I know the MFA has that musical instruments exhibit, and they do a lot of work with. Well, I wonder if you can make some connections with them and bring this even further.
Yeah, I would be interested to try to do that. Thanks.
Jacob, tremendous work. Wow, fantastic. I side with everybody's comments. It's fantastic to see you grow and playing your heart out. Man. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Just to I've been thinking as I was watching this. This is the second time I saw this. And I still have some questions about. I'm trying to put myself in a situation of because this got so many directions, as he mentioned, and Terry too. There's an artistic component that is very strong. There's no doubt, music, but also there is so much potential as a presentation for you to go around and tour and expand the work of the mandolin and really speak in behalf of this. But I'm would advise you to probably create 2 or 3 more versions of this story. I tell you why. Because when you start with the African tradition, one of the things that I was, first of all, I think it would be helpful if you play the sounds of the instrument you discover. Because I didn't relate to, I felt immediately like that. I felt like I was hearing a very Afro-American influence in that direction with John Scofield. I got lost a little bit in that connection. The only connection you make with Africa was in the rhythmic aspect. And I think I didn't really hear on the sound as much. So probably would be a lot easier if you start, my advice, is that you can disregard it, but probably to start where you came from at the beginning, boom. So we relate to that sound stays in our mind, and then you relate to every one of those continents in certain ways that is more, for example, the African, you relate it to the 12/8 rhythm, which was fantastic. And there is so much more in the context of articulation, color, scaling, you know what I mean? So you leave that connection a little bit more clear for me.
Okay.
Then in the terms, I think the Celtic connection is very direct. I mean, that kind of, starting there would be a great point. I know I think we talk about it a little bit, but I think you were trying to do it chronologically. But I think it loses me a little bit in the sense of the storytelling and the sounds that before I get to, I don't want to think of Jonas Scofield before I get to, I'm just talking for other people. He's a master of these sounds, so he's very familiar with, but for anybody, that I would advise you to go a little more like,
to reorder
to the connections that are very relevant, like that I can recognize. Like, wow, that sounds completely different. That's a mandolin. Okay, I don't have doubts. Like, oh, that sounds like, what is that? A guitar? Or
I see.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and then you mentioned something I would like to talk about. Why you say that? You say you wanted to know. You say why. You didn't want, you know that it's obvious that people relates Brazil, Scotland, Italy, they all connected. I think you said something like that. I want you to tell me what you mean by that.
So that was here in the conclusion, which I was just a comment about sort of my realization and process and my own conclusion from this project, that because I had these 4 different places which seem so unrelated to me, but then once I started looking, I could really see that those connections are there, that the connections are real, through whatever way, the people, mostly through the people, coming and going and different things happening, and the culture that they brought with them. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't have an answer, but I'm still confused about that because that's the potential of this project, and it could be so important in terms of like expanding the word.
Okay.
That I think that's one key element, that through a connection of sound or a connection of a rhythmic idea. I mean, I don't really have the answer. I think nobody basically in this room, but I think that's something that in this project, that when you make that conclusion, I also will I understand the humanitarian part, but I would encourage you to look for that closing statement, like ta 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 ta, and end it,
Yeah.
So when we leave with the music, because I get the zero gravity, and I will say about the free jazz thing also that comment, but I get that you're expanding the language, you're connecting with America. And then the last thing I just say would be helpful to close with this presentation with a traditional song of your birthright, the United States. Take it back to the United States. Play a traditional song and go through all the continents and see if you can demonstrate. I think that might help.
To play the same song, but as if it was from Africa or as if it was from...
Right.
Okay.
Because now you're going to say, oh, okay, how do I make it really be clear about the African continent? You know what I mean? I think that would conclude something that I'm feeling a little bit as a question mark. I like the question mark.
Yeah, like more of a conclusion about the musical connections instead of just the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I have been a privilege working with you. I love the vibe. I really do. I want to give you with this thought that I was thinking. What if, when the word close your mind, like, like what if? Every time, what if? What if? What if? What about if we think like, replace them with more word like, which we should do or we should find? That's what you're doing. Congratulations.
Okay.
Jacob Min, congratulations.
And thanks again to Joe and Marco, Danilo, Terry. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you.
See you tomorrow, 10 o'clock for the last day. Thank you.